going to talk about Black history through the centuries.
Black History Month goes from October 1st to October 31st, but we personally think that it should be celebrated all the time.
So we here at Lady Ridge High School are going to proceed into November.
To the 17th century. Black people have lived in Britain for ages. Although the circumstances have varied greatly, some have been enslaved, some have been exploited. Whilst others have enjoyed privilege and status, records show that Black Britons have lived in the UK as far back as the 12th century. It was only when the Empire increased their number in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Black British history has meant lots of different things at different times. It tends to mean the story of black people in Britain, but I think it means something much bigger than that. I think it's Britain's relationship with Africa and Africans, both here in Britain, in the Caribbean and in North America, and also in Africa itself. And the reason I think it's important is because these are the stories, and this is the history that explains why Britain looks the way it does today. Why the faces that you see when you walk through the streets of our cities are so varied. The African story, the story of black people, is part of that complicated mix that's created the country we are today. The great Jamaican British philosopher and academic Stuart Hall once said, "We are here because you were there." These are the stories that make sense of why there are people like me in Britain, black British people. But it's also a story that's been edited out in lots of ways of British history. For example, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we often talk about the way the factories and the mills worked. We learned about spinning jennies and water frames and Factories Act and child labour. We go, many of us as children, to heritage sites where we have explained to us how those mills work. But there's one bit of the story of the Industrial Revolution that we rarely talk about, which is that the 4,500 mills of Lancashire and southern Scotland that are at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, producing cotton clothing, which was Britain's biggest export, employing directly or indirectly maybe 1 in 5 people in the 1850s. The cotton in those 4,500 mills comes from North America, and it's produced by 1.8 million African Americans who are living lives as slaves. We can't tell an honest, wholehearted, full-blooded history of the Industrial Revolution unless we tell the story of where the raw materials in the mills came from. And we've got in the habit of not doing that. We've got in the habit of telling partial histories that miss out the bits of our history that explain and show how our interaction with Africa and Africans have been repeatedly central to the British story. There's the story of the Atlantic slave trade in the 17th, 18th century. There's the story of American slavery of cotton in the 19th century. There's the story of the scramble for Africa in the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s. Time and again, over and over again, the story of Africa and Africans has been very central to British history. So black British history isn't a marginal subject that is only about and only of interest to black people. It is British history. It's at the centre of our story, and most importantly of all, it's a shared history. It's a story of interaction, and it's a story that belongs to all of us.
As the British Empire expanded, African and Afro-Caribbean slaves were ferried across the seas to work on plantations in the Caribbean and Americas, some of which were ferried to the London and Liverpool docks. One of the many slaves trafficked was George Scipio. George was taken from what was now known as Sierra Leone and was forced into slavery. By the time he died, 70 years later, he was a rent-collecting landlord, kept the peace in Nottingham, and owned his own business.
In the 18th century, black servants and slaves formed the largest group of black workers. However, a few black people formed independent lives, meaning that they were free to direct their own lives and had the ability to make their own choices. The small numbers that had independent lives were usually helped by former slave masters. Ignatius Sancho was one of the most successful black men in the 18th century, and he was a former slave. He was also one of the most influential black men and was a symbol of the humanity of Africans and the immorality of the slave trade. He was the first black British man to vote during a general election and had many successful sonnets and poems. He was also a member of Sons of Africa, an abolitionment group that was spearheaded by William Wilberforce. This group campaigned for the eventual abolishment of slavery in 1807.
And now on to the 19th century. The 19th century was a very important century because this was when the slave trade was abolished, and despite the social injustice and discrimination still in Victorian England, there were many successful black people such as John Edmondson and Ira Aldridge, which you will see the amazing things they've done on the slide if you just pause here.
During World War I, there was a small increase in the size of black communities. This was because of the arrival of soldiers and merchant seamen. There was also a rise in students from Africa and the Caribbean migrating to London. One black soldier who served during World War I was Walter Tull, an English professional footballer who was born to a Caribbean carpenter in 1888. He played for Tottenham Hotspur/Clapton FC in his early life and later went on to become a captain in the army in 1916. Walter Tull was the first black officer to command white troops in the First World War. He was sadly shot and killed whilst crossing no man's land and attacking a German trench.
Racism in football is nothing new. When it happens, it usually gets reported, and then everyone knows what's going on. But when do you think the first stories started appearing in the newspapers reporting racism directed towards a black British footballer? 1980s? 1970s? Well, as it happens, the story's a lot older than people might realise. Walter Tull was the grandson of a slave from Barbados. In 1909, he was signed from amateur side Clapton by Tottenham Hotspur. Walter quickly showed his talent. Soon he was playing against Manchester United, and the papers were duly impressed. But the reports also told another side to the story. As well as praising his skill, the newspapers made a point of emphasizing how Tull remained professional and composed, despite the intense provocation. Sadly, it wasn't long before Tottenham felt it was better for Tull to move on to Northampton FC. This wasn't due to a lack of skill or application on Walter's part, and it's to Northampton's credit that they later built a memorial to him. But that wasn't the end of the story, because Walter Tull's remarkable life then changed direction when he went off to fight in the First World War and became the first black officer to command white British troops. He fought at the Battle of the Somme as part of the Middlesex Regiment before ultimately losing his life in northern France near the village of Faverolles. Now, you might think that Walter Tull would be a well-known historical figure by now, but it hasn't worked out that way. So how many other British heroes do we need to rediscover and celebrate today? Because by the values of today or the past, Walter Tull was a hero, and heroes deserve commemoration. Over 110 years later, we can all look back and reflect on how racial prejudice held back Walter's career, just as it still holds back many people today. But a hero he remains.
Finally, here we are in the 21st century. The death of George Floyd has been the pinnacle of the Black Lives Matter movement in the 21st century. Sadly, on the 25th of May, George Floyd died was under arrest after having a police officer kneeling on his neck for around 8 minutes whilst the other cops were watching. His death, although, has not gone in vain. There have been many protests around the world demanding that racial equality is achieved. One person is Stormzy. Marco Quadro, who goes by the stage name of Stormzy, is a British rapper grime artist. He is known for songs such as Crown and Blinded by Your Grace. He offered two scholarships to 2 black students to go to Cambridge University. He did this because there's a study showing there's a lower percentage of students going to top university in the UK. Stormzy took his stride and wanted to change this.
Thanks for listening. We hope this presentation has educated you.